I'm at the international headquarters of the United Nations, where today the UN General Assembly voted overwhelmingly to adopt a resolution condemning the US blockade of Cuba. The final vote count was 185 yes, 2 no, and 2 abstentions. This is the 30th year in a row the UN General Assembly has adopted this resolution, but it's also the 30th year in a row the United States has completely ignored the will of the international community. The economic embargo of Cuba, which many people refer to as the blockade, was implemented 60 years ago, and today is so strict that it bars companies wanting to do trade in the United States from also trading with Cuba, even for basic goods like food and medicine. That's why the blockade is commonly referred to as illegal, inhumane, and a violation of the UN Charter, and why it's widely condemned by human rights groups, entire countries, and of course, the UN General Assembly. The final vote counts on the annual resolutions speak for themselves. In the last few years, the votes have come out 184 to 2, 187 to 3, 189 to 2, 191 to 2. In fact, there are only 2 countries that regularly vote against the resolution: the United States and Israel. Despite this, the US continues to enforce the blockade, even tightening restrictions in recent years. Why? To understand the US's refusal to comply with the worldwide consensus on ending the blockade, we have to first understand why the blockade was put in place to begin with. When most of us think of Cuba, we might think of socialism or the Cold War. But before 1959, Cuba was a virtual neo-colony of the United States. Almost all of the industry and resources on the island were owned by US corporations. While it was Cubans who worked the factories and the fields, who harvested the sugar and mined the nickel, when these goods were sold, it was these foreign businessmen who pocketed all the profits. They would occasionally come down to the island to visit, but not to live with the people, just to have them bring them drinks while they sunbathed by the pool and partied in nightclubs. Despite living in a country rich in resources and abundant with beautiful tourist attractions, most Cubans lived in dire poverty and couldn't read or write. Before 1959, 85% of rural homes lacked running water, and 90% of rural homes lacked electricity. For every 100 students attending public schools, only 6 completed the 6th grade. On top of that, like the United States, Cuba also had its own Jim Crow-like apartheid system where black Cubans were barred from businesses and institutions that only white Cubans had access to. The systemic looting of Cuba by US corporations was overseen and protected by a US-backed dictator named Fulgencio Batista, who used torture and secret police to crush any rebellion or dissent among the Cuban people. It was precisely this looting and brutal repression that inspired Fidel Castro and his band of guerrilla fighters to wage a campaign that overthrew Batista in 1959. Initially, the US was friendly towards the new Castro government, but that quickly changed. One of the first actions of the new government was to implement a countrywide land reform, which gave land to those who had no land by taking it from Cuba's largest landowners, who happened to mostly be US corporations, putting Cuban land back in the hands of those who worked it. This would become Cuba's original sin. Immediately after the land reform, the Eisenhower administration began drawing up plans to overthrow the Castro government. Now, typically, when the US wants to overthrow a government, they support political opposition groups in the country and try to push them into power. The problem with Cuba was that there was no major internal political opposition to Fidel Castro. In a 1960 memo, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State Lester Mallory expressed disappointment in the fact that the majority of Cubans supported Fidel Castro and that no other group had nearly enough popularity to challenge him. In the memo, Mallory concludes that the only way to get Castro out of power was to strangle the Cuban economy and to cause so much misery and suffering that the Cuban people blamed it on the Castro government. The Mallory memo called for the US to adopt a policy to, quote, weaken the economic life of Cuba and, quote, decrease monetary and real wages to bring about hunger, desperation, and the overthrow of government. The Mallory memo would go on to become the foundation of US policy towards Cuba for the next 60 years. Just 2 months after the Mallory memo was written, the Eisenhower administration stopped US oil sales to Cuba, forcing Cuba to turn to the Soviet Union for crude oil. But this oil needed to be refined. But since all of the oil refineries were owned by the United States, the US simply told these companies not to refine the oil. This led to Cuba nationalizing the oil refineries, to which Eisenhower responded by imposing a partial embargo on Cuba's sugar exports, one of Cuba's largest export markets, 80% of which went to the United States. 2 years later, the Kennedy administration turned the partial embargo into a full embargo on all US transactions with Cuba under the US Trading with the Enemies Act. The blockade remained in place throughout the Cold War, but one might expect that after the Cold War was over, there would be no need to blockade Cuba. After all, the United States declared that the fall of the Soviet Union proved unequivocally that capitalism was superior to socialism. But the United States actually did the opposite, tightening the blockade several times in the following years. In 1992, the U.S. passed the Cuban Democracy Act, which prohibited ships that had docked in Cuba from docking in U.S. ports for 180 days. It also gave the president the authority to cut U.S. foreign aid to any country that aided Cuba. In 1996, the U.S. passed the Helms-Burton Act, which extended the purview of the embargo even further to any foreign company that traded with Cuba. Given the choice between trading with Cuba in the largest economy in the world, the United States, most companies have no choice but to choose the United States, effectively barring Cuba from the world market and only able to buy with jacked up prices. All of this coming from the country that constantly talks about free trade. Then, in 2020, the Trump administration imposed new restrictions on travel to Cuba, sending remittances, and even put Cuba back on the state sponsors of terrorism list. After last year's landslide UN vote to end the blockade, the US issued a statement defending the blockade, saying that it didn't block any humanitarian aid or medicine. We asked the Cuban ambassador to the United Nations if this was true, to which he responded that this claim was nothing but a bold-faced lie.
I would just refer to an example, very close example, which is the pandemic. And we couldn't access the US market to acquire such a thing like medicinal oxygen when we faced an oxygen crisis in Cuba during the pandemic. We asked for authorization to buy, oxygen in the US, and we were neglected that. We neglected that authorization, and that was a very humanitarian thing. We were supposed to receive, there were companies, there were non-governmental organizations that were ready to provide Cuba a lot of stuff, a lot of spare parts for hospitals, for example, during the pandemic. We had the case of a very significant Chinese company. They were ready. They even sent the products to Cuba. Those products never reached Cuban ports because of the U.S. embargo in Cuba.
So maybe that's why the whole world is united against the blockade, because it's reached a point of absurdity where the U.S. is blocking sales of oxygen to Cuba during a global pandemic. This level of cruelty might also explain why over 100 members of Congress from Joe Biden's own party have called on him to lift the embargo, something Biden promised to do on the campaign trail but has since ignored. There's also a growing number of city councils that have passed resolutions calling on the U.S. to lift the blockade. It's estimated that Cuba loses $15 million a day due to the blockade, but where the country may have been had the blockade never been enacted is impossible to quantify. The United States first enacted the blockade to crush Cuba's alternative system and to force Cuba back into its place as the U.S.'s neo-colony through economic isolation. But 60 years later, it's the United States that's isolated itself, desperately clinging to this policy relic of the Cold War, standing completely alone on the world stage.